welcome back to Voice of Super, ASFA's podcast for the superannuation community. And today we're exploring one of my favourite topics and one of the most fundamental questions in economic policy. So strap in. We're going to explore, are we measuring what really matters? Because for decades, countries have relied primarily on GDP to gauge economic success. But GDP only counts what's bought and sold in the market economy. So in 2023, we saw the Commonwealth Government launch a comprehensive wellbeing framework designed to complement GDP with 50 indicators across 5 themes. And we were thinking of it like a national dashboard that tracks everything from mental health and housing affordability to biodiversity and social trust. This week, Treasury and the ABS released an update to Australia's Measuring What Matters dashboard, updating 44 of the 50 wellbeing indicators. I think what's still particularly striking is what's missing. So how do we use this to make meaningful measurement, particularly of women's unpaid contributions and their connection to retirement security? And so how does super fit into all this, and how can we use the Measuring What Matters framework and the work of economists in this space to better retirement outcomes and to better capture unpaid work? I think are the two sort of things to cover. We've only got about 20 minutes, so I think we should solve it by the end. Joining me today to discuss this is Dr. Jenny Gordon from the Lowy Instiute and from the Australian National University. And Jenny brings a unique perspective to this discussion because she established the Office of the Chief Economist at DFAT and led a major policy inquiries at the Productivity Commission into sectors where women's unpaid work is most pronounced, so aged care, childcare and the not-for-profit sector. So welcome, Jenny. It's actually such a thrill to have you here. We've just had this update to Measuring What Matters, but let's go back a few years when the policy was being explored. What was the conversations at the time? How did this come about?
So there's been a long-term interest in what GDP doesn't measure and then how much that actually matters for people's well-being. So for a long time, we thought it was fine. We didn't need to worry too much. We could sort of say that if the economy was growing, then all the things related to it would be getting better as well. So you could kind of say, well, GDP was okay. And then the environmental people came in and said, well, actually, you're using up the environment and GDP doesn't measure the use up of the environment. So that's one problem. And then long time we've said, well, hang on a sec, what about all this household work? And we've had a really interesting phenomena because a lot of care work and even things like household production, your veggie garden and things like that, were not counted in the national accounts, and yet they're real production. And so GDP can go up simply because those move into the market economy. And so it looks like GDP has gone up, but in fact, total production hasn't really gone up. So it's only if moving things into the market economy make it more efficient and more productive that you're actually getting a net benefit out of this. And I think there's some really interesting conversations to be had about, what actually makes people feel fulfilled in their lives. And that includes after retirement as well, just as important. Paid work isn't everything. And so how do we measure that? Because unfortunately, government policy needs to measure things to be able to say we care about it. And we need to sort of say, is it getting better or is it getting worse? And that's what this new Measuring What Matters framework is trying to at least say, let's take the first steps. What can we look at to say, is there a general sense of whether things are getting better? And we're realising that a lot of these things aren't necessarily correlated highly with GDP anymore.
And so before we get into how can this possibly relate to super, can you tell us a little bit about what you saw from this week's release and those updated indicators?
So there was the indicators are interesting because a lot of them are still actually a few years ago. So they sort of finish in 2023, 24, and there's only a few, mostly in the economic stuff because we measure that one more regularly, that are actually 2020, 24 or 25 measures. And so what we saw in the ones that have got trend data is COVID really knocked people around. It sort of really did detract from people's feelings of well-being across a range of dimensions. And we saw post-COVID an uptick, things getting a little better. But what we've seen since is a little bit of a deterioration. And then some of the worrying ones are things particularly around the care economy, so NDIS and care for older people with needs, and are those care needs being met? And we're finding that those indicators, despite big increases in investment in NDIS and in aged care, are not getting better. So that's a really interesting question around what are Australians' expectations and are the government policies meeting those expectations? And so that's something that we really have to have a really good conversation about what our expectations are, how much we think government should be paying for those things, and how much people should be funding them themselves. And so that's a really big debate that Australia needs to have, and we're not having it. And so measures like that help tell us, say, hey, why is this happening? How can we think about this? How can we do better?
Gee, that is a crucial data point, isn't it? And I wonder, at the moment, I feel like we're using measuring what matters in a wellbeing framework like a report card as opposed to a decision-making tool. And is at some point, have you seen in other jurisdictions that there's been a flipping point, or do you have to be really intentional about that?
Well, I think you have to actually be really intentional, and you have to. What I liked about this framework is it kind of shows that you're not even going to capture everything. So the one thing it doesn't capture, obviously, is what's happening to people's unpaid hour works, and the trend we know is that women are working more outside the home. So women's participation rates, labour force participation rates, are converging to those of men, and so they're not much behind anymore. A lot
Mm.
more of them work part-time than men work part-time, but even that's changing because more men are working part-time and more women are working full-time. And so they're trending to be much the same. But when you look at the amount of time spent on household work, women still do, something like 67%, I think, somewhere around there of the household work. And so that's the missing indicator that is an important indicator.
I think that's an interesting point to explore. So I really think that from a superannuation sector point of view, we can think in three different ways about this particular exploration of well-being measures and measuring what matters. One of them is, as we were just touching on earlier, that retirement outcomes will be impacted simply because of the nature of our system by how much time you can spend in the paid labour force. And if you're of the gender who is doing more of the unpaid work, then it's going to have a relationship to your retirement outcome. So we can think about it that way, and we can use that measure in that way. I think, or to inform us, I suppose, and to sort of insist on compensatory measures or changes societally because we can see what's happening there. I think the other part to use to sort of inform conversations is about how retirement is, looks and feels, and what's really happening, which is a little bit about the life you were just describing. How do you actually make a retirement and life after work good for everyone? And this goes beyond just having financial advice. It goes to also being able to know what makes people happy and connected and live well. And I think it helps in that space. And I wonder, though, can we explore the third space for a second, which is, does this matter to investors? And how does it matter to economic development? What is it telling us about prosperity and national, I guess, growth or international growth even? What does it matter for an investor?
So that last one is a really good space, actually, and it's an interesting space because we've had, Milton Friedman shareholder value focus for a long time, and a lot of that has got quite short term. So, managers of firms care about, the next quarter or the next 6 months and the share price. And so doing things like cutting labor as the easiest way to boost your share price, you've just seen, another major company sort of sack another, 9,000 people and the like. And so that's the thing that sort of short term does shareholder value, or share price. And so we look at that. But what matters in the long run is actually the innovative nature of the economy, the overall rise in productivity. Those are the things that are going to drive the long term outcomes for companies and for investment. So we need to be thinking about it on a broader scale. And so if you have a system that really rewards a smaller segment of the labour force, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing wages for the people at the top who have skills that are in short supply or who are lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. We're seeing their wages go up through the roof and everybody else's wages be much more, particularly in the US, stagnate. This is a little less in Australia because we've still got remnants of an awards system where, the top going up tends to drag up everybody else, and we have a high minimum wage. But you lead to discontent. And then if you get bad politics, you get policies that are really amicable to growth. You've got businesses really reluctant to invest right now because they're not sure what's going to happen with Trump's tariff regime. And so we're seeing a chilling of business investment. One of the things in the national accounts, which was a couple of weeks ago, was that business investment growth has not shifted and it's low. Non-mining business investment in Australia. And that's really worrying because we need to be seeing that growth. And even though super funds can invest globally, they're always going to have a major Australian exposure. And what we really want to see is vibrant global markets and growth. And so there is this feedback loop that Milton Friedman and the sort of neoliberal economists ignored, which is that feedback loop through to if you get rising inequality, if you get rising discontent with governments, and if you get government corruption and you see a smaller share of the population doing better and better and everybody else being left behind, you end up with the terrible problem of bad politics and populist policies that actually hurt everybody. And so as investors, you want, particularly when you're in the retirement phase, is you want stability. You don't want volatility because you may need to be cashing out at the time that the market is at a low point. So some volatility is always going to be there, but you don't want a highly volatile market where things are great or things are terrible, right? You want a market that's much more stable, but you also want a market that's looking about, actually, my portfolio depends on global growth. And the value of my portfolio is incredibly vulnerable because of the structure of a lot of the way we buy index funds and the like. We're very exposed to what stock markets do. Private equity is a harder one, right? There's more and more in private equity and less in the stock market now. So firms that should be in the stock market are not in the stock market. And they're held by private equity. And so that's less opaque and we don't really know what's going on. But overall, we've got to have this broader economic growth across the world for actually our portfolios to do well and to be more stable and to be more resilient to shocks. And so those are the things that really ultimately matter for the superannuation industry. I mean, the ones in the accumulation phase, they're saying, what's that overall global growth going to look like? Is there going to be a structure where, you don't have a government in the United States say, oh, sorry, holders of US treasuries, we're converting you to something called century bonds and going to pay you zero coupon. And that's a worry, right? So we actually need a system that has political stability, a system that means that nobody feels so left behind that they want to disrupt the whole system, and a system that actually encourages innovation and productivity growth, because those are the things that are going to grow those portfolio balances over time. That's what we want.
Oh, well, I agree. That sounds like a lovely world to be a part of. Let's look back over then the way in which you've sort of, I guess, throughout various stages of your career, prosecuted the argument that these wellbeing measures or measurements of wellbeing need to be explored, and where you've used them in the past. And maybe we can end on what you kind of hope for. Where do you think that this is taking us, and what do you want the national conversation to be?
So we did some early work at the Productivity Commission in 2008 that never quite saw the light of day, which I've always thought was unfortunate, that expanded our measures of, outcomes and introduced a sort of more formal wellbeing framework. And while that work didn't get published in the end, it did inform a bunch of things. So if you look at our aged care report that we did back then, we actually had a wellbeing framework in there because we said, what is it that older people value? And we asked them, we went out and asked them, what do they value? And they valued being able to have choice, valued having control over their lives, and particularly in aged care, those sorts of things were important. And so you're trying to design a system that actually has this formal wellbeing framework in place. Childcare is an interesting one, right? So, we know there's a whole bunch of research that early childhood development from actually prenatal all the way through to the age of 2 matters incredibly for the health and long-term productivity of that small person as they grow over time. And so it's not just a matter of bleeding heart, we should be looking after the elderly and we should be looking after the kids because it's the right thing to do, though it is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
It's actually, it's actually, how do we improve productivity of lives? And so when you'd asked about other countries, New Zealand had the concept of a wellbeing budget that was introduced with Jacinta Ardern. And the challenge was, of course, it had, some indicators around childhood poverty, and when they went the wrong way, instead of childhood poverty coming down, which unfortunately it went up, for a variety of reasons, not all to do with government policy. You get the kind of, well, should we have this wellbeing budget? And so
Right.
it's kind of sort of got
Sort of
abandoned a
the
bit
wrong. Yeah. Yeah.
in New Zealand.
Okay.
And so you have this challenge about we need to keep going. It's the same way of closing the gap measurement. Sometimes those gaps widen, and sometimes those gaps widen not because government policy isn't actually leaning against the trend, it's because the trend is really bad. And so you've got built-in long-term, declines, and government policy slows down that decline, but you still get a decline. So these are some of the things that measurement makes these harder. Communicating measurement can be quite hard as well. But there's policy people who understand the intricacies of these and understand what is actually whether your policy worked or not. And that's the important component on the policy making side. So we've kind of been incorporating this stuff for a while. It's in there, but the public facing stuff is kind of hard to explain sometimes.
Yeah, I think my hope is that every sort of sector across Australia picks it up and understands it for how it might apply to their decision making over time, just as well as we understand economic indicators. We've got to understand these human ones as well. And it seems if we're trying to, as superannuation sector, better cater for a more holistic role in retirement, that we need to understand this as well. We need to know what it means as an investor. And I think we need to use these measures probably more accurately to describe the relationship between unpaid labour and retirement outcomes, particularly for women. So I think there's a lot for super in here. But as you say, we have to be sort of intentional about using it. But I think we should, we'll explore it more. Maybe we'll come back and talk to you again, Jenny, about some of those particular areas, but more in depth, because clearly it's a subject matter that you and I both quite like. So maybe there's more to be said about it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'd be very happy to come back and chat more.
Well, let's make sure we make that happen. And please, everyone who's listening, thanks so much for tuning in again. This has been Voice of Super, the superannuation, the podcast, should I say, for the superannuation sector, by the superannuation sector, talking about measuring what matters today. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe if you want to not miss any future episodes.